In our first case study, we looked at the degradation of information accuracy as it passes from one source to another. And what started out as a well-researched and nuanced explanation of the damage that chronic stress can do to the brain, the immune system, and life expectancy was translated into a tabloid article that discarded all of the research and all the nuance and replaced it with simplistic and inaccurate descriptions of a plan for curbing that damage. The tabloid article was then picked up by a popular conspiracy monger and turned into a story about a global conspiracy controlling people's minds with nanotech brain-eating viruses. The point of that case study was to see how the sources sift through data to find half-truths that fit into pre-existing narrative frames. It is the coherence of the story rather than the accuracy of the information that we tend to use when deciding what to believe and what to question. We tend to forget where we learned a piece of information. This is called source amnesia. We even forget whether there was any reason to believe that claim to start with. So if we think something is wrong when we first hear it, we may later remember that claim, but forget that it was untrue. And this is called truth amnesia. Since then, we've looked at how facts can lead us to conclusions, and that they never do so on their own. Facts are connected to conclusions by inferences, and when we make these inferences explicit, we're making an argument. We can map arguments out with syllogisms. That means listing the premises necessary to come to a conclusion, and then realizing that these stated premises rely on unstated premises, or warrants, to connect them to conclusions. An enthymeme is a statement that states a claim or a conclusion, as well as at least one reason or premise. We can rearrange that enthymeme to find out what the warrant is that's necessary for the premise to actually lead to the conclusion. And we can decide whether that warrant is valid or invalid. This is important because even if our premises are true, they can lead us to incorrect conclusions if they are not part of a valid argument. As long as we have a claim and a reason, we have enough information to identify an unstated premise, the warrant. And the warrant is often where the disagreement lies. For example, if I made the claim that college students should get free flu vaccines, and I had the reason that they're more likely to transmit the virus from one population to another because they travel more, then I could take the components of the claim and the reason and rearrange them to find the warrant. The warrant is that if someone is likely to transmit the flu virus to a new population, that person should get a free flu vaccine. Once I identify that warrant, whether or not I'm making this argument myself or arguing against this argument, then I know what has to be done beyond just proving the reason. So the reason should be supported by evidence. And in this case, I might cite peer-reviewed academic research showing that viruses travel more quickly through college-age populations. But that's just the reason. I also have to consider the warrant. Why might someone disagree with that? What other questions would that warrant lead them to ask? So in this case, someone might say that, yes, I see that it's important to get the vaccines, but why should it be free? Where will the money come from? Or some people might understand the warrant but have an alternative warrant, such as whoever stands to suffer the most, whoever's health risk is the greatest should get the free flu vaccine. So children and the elderly would be more likely to suffer than college students would, so they should be the ones that get the free flu vaccine. But I have to make that warrant explicit before I know where the argument has to go from there. Now, in our second case study, we're going to look at an ongoing issue. Our readings for this particular case study are about 7 years old now, but the conversation that they're a part of is over 20 years old, and it's still relevant. It's still something that influences people and the decisions they make about their health and the health of other people around them. The belief that autism and other vaguely understood disorders are caused by vaccines of various types is several decades old, but it got a shot in the arm, if you will, about 20 years ago in a paper written by the medical researcher Andrew Wakefield, and several other co-authors are on the paper, but as we'll see shortly, those co-authors had very little to do with the actual conducting the research. But this paper claimed to see a connection between MMR vaccination, a brain bowel disorder or syndrome, and that brain bowel disorder being a causal link to autism. Specifically regressive autism. In other words, a child was developing normally, but then got the MMR vaccine, and the claim was that that child started to regress from normal health and to show autistic symptoms. This paper has been made famous by activists who have always suspected a link between vaccination and autism, but As far as scientific research goes, this is the only peer-reviewed academic paper that has actually claimed to show a link. And so it's extremely important whether or not this paper is accurate. So in this paper, Wakefield did research on 12 children whose parents claimed that they had regressive autism. And he interviewed the parents and he reviewed the medical records, and he claimed that from this group of 12, he was able to show the existence of a brain bowel disorder or syndrome that had been previously undiagnosed. And he implicated in the paper and then announced publicly in a press conference about the paper that this research proved a causal link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Now, this was a peer-reviewed academic article. Its format followed the MRAD format. It established, here's what we set out to find, here's the methods we use, here's the results we found, and here are our conclusions. It was then submitted to peer review, in this case with the very old and reputable medical journal, The Lancet. And in past lectures, I've said that peer review ideally is like throwing your idea into a shark tank. But in this case, the sharks have red pens, and they're going to try to find everything wrong with your research, both the methods you used or the data you started with. And they're going to look for any sign of motivated reasoning or hasty generalization or anything like that. But as I said when I talked about peer review, sometimes bad, unscientific, poorly researched articles do make it through this process. This is about the best process for vetting information that we have, but it's not a perfect process, and sometimes failures make it through to look like successes, and that seems to be what happened with Wakefield's paper. But the review process doesn't stop after publication. In fact, you might say that the review process can only make the research available to a few reviewers, but once it's published in a professional journal or an academic journal, then many more people are going to read the article, and they're not going to read it just for its conclusions. Those other experts that read that journal are also going to look at the methods, and they're going to ask, did this paper actually earn its conclusion? Did these authors actually follow a critical enough methodology to have earned the conclusion? And that secondary review process, the post-publication process, isn't just limited to people in academic disciplines. In this case, the journalist Brian Deere reviewed Wakefield's evidence, and he went back and did his own research. He interviewed parents, he looked at what medical records were available to him, and he compared those with the details about these children that were published in Wakefield's paper. And he published his findings, or at least the discrepancies between Wakefield's reporting of the child's symptoms and the parents' accounts of the child's symptoms. He published several articles in Britain's Sunday Times. And the notoriety that this public criticism got led Britain's General Medical Council to review Wakefield's study themselves. The General Medical Council in the United Kingdom is the governing body that decides who has the ability to practice medicine, who has a medical license. And they were able to do a much more in-depth investigation. They were able to get access to the patient's medical records that Brian Deere was not able to get access to. So they had a much larger range of data in order to investigate whether or not Wakefield's paper accurately represented the evidence for its conclusion about a connection between this brain bowel disorder and autism. And what they found corroborated Brian Deere's investigation. That is, they found that the medical records did not match what Wakefield published. In other words, Wakefield changed the data to fit a foregone conclusion. This is not just getting something wrong. In science, you get things wrong all the time. That's what falsification is all about. If you're wrong, you want to find out. But if Wakefield did what it appears that he did, if he deliberately changed the data because he did not want to find out he was wrong, he only wanted to prove himself right, then that would be fraud. And that's what the General Medical Council found, and when they reported their findings to The Lancet, eventually The Lancet retracted the paper. And it was after that retraction that the British Medical Journal, another reputable journal in Great Britain, asked Brian Deere to write about his investigation for their publication. And that's why the editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, Fiona Godley, writes an introductory explanation as to why a medical journal, whose authors are typically medical researchers and doctors, why they asked journalists to publish in their journal. And so Godley introduces the case of the Wakefield paper, its retraction by the Lancet. She describes just how much research Brian Deer has done into this. It's 7 years of research by Brian Deer, corroborated by the General Medical Council's longest ever fitness to practice hearing, which resulted in not only the retraction, but also Wakefield losing his license to practice medicine. And as she points out, this should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. People continued to hold up Wakefield's study as if it proved something. And so the BMJ wanted to make it clear just how much fraud could be demonstrated on Wakefield's part. And the British Medical Journal was able to go beyond what Brian Deer was able to investigate. They were able to get access to the General Medical Council's 6 million word transcript and check Deer's findings themselves. So not only has the General Medical Council come behind Brian Deer and followed up on his investigation, but also the British Medical Journal was able to follow up on his investigation with information that Deer himself did not have access to. And they confirmed extensive falsification of Wakefield's paper. Not just falsification of some of the evidence, but every one of the 12 children that Wakefield used as evidence of this link between the MMR, this brain bowel syndrome, and autism, every single case was misrepresented in Wakefield's paper. As she says, the MMR scare was based not on bad science, in other words, not scientists getting something wrong and then only later finding it out, but it was actually deliberate fraud. But it was because the original paper got so much media attention, because it was used by so many people to justify not having their children vaccinated. This is why, according to Godley, the British Medical Journal asked Brian Deer to publish yet again. So for 7 years, Brian Deer gathered information based on parent interviews and interviewing the doctors who diagnosed the children that were used as evidence in Wakefield's study, and he compared that to the way those children were described. Even though they were anonymous in the Wakefield paper, he could still try to match up the symptoms with the individual children. And he was not able to do that, and then he followed along with the British Medical Council as they did their own investigation. And his conclusion, the conclusion he comes to after all of this, is that of the 12 children that were used as evidence, no case was free of misreporting or alteration. Taking together, the National Health Service records cannot be reconciled with what was published to such devastating effect in the journal. We can rephrase his argument to say that the findings of Wakefield's article have not been proven because they depend on fabricated and selected evidence. So his main reason, the stated premise, is that Wakefield's findings depend on fabricated and selected evidence. So his next step is to prove that the findings are based on fabricated and selected evidence. That is the majority of this article. Once you've established your main premise, then it's time to prove it. So a warrant can be hypothetical if someone agrees with it, but even if we agree on a warrant, you have to prove that the specific evidence justifies applying the warrant. For example, if I say that you should take an umbrella because it's going to rain, you may agree that the umbrella is needed in the rain, but if it's sunny outside, you may want to know how I know it's going to rain. I may need to back up my claim. Did I get the information from a weather app, or am I just speculating? So in an argument, the reasons aren't enough. You need evidence to support it. And as a journalist, this is what Brian Deer specializes in. So one source of evidence was interviews with the parents. As he says at the very beginning, he interviewed the father of the anonymous child known as child number 11. And from this father, he gets information like child 11 was originally child 13. And now there's only 12 in the paper. That is case for selected evidence, and we'll come back to the selection of evidence in just a minute. He also sees evidence of fabrication from this interview with the father of child number 11. It is the father himself who looks at the description of his son and says, "That's not my son." Certain very important details have been changed. He also interviewed the mother of child number 2. He's doing this in order to establish a timeline, because if this child is going to be used as evidence that the MMR vaccine causes autism, then Wakefield has to establish that the symptoms of autism began after the child received the MMR vaccine, but not so far after the vaccination that it could have been from another cause, or it could have been completely independently caused. So he asked the mother, when did the child's behavioral symptoms begin? And he's asking her this years after all of this has actually happened. So she has to remember. She says that began after a couple months, a few months afterward. So notice when she follows a couple months with a few months, that may not seem like a big deal to her because she's focused on the narrative of a causal narrative where she got this first and then this happened, therefore the second thing must have happened because of the first. She's already certain of that, but he's not. So he wants to know exactly, with as much specificity as possible, how much time lapsed between the vaccination and the symptoms. So he says, sorry, I don't mean to be like massively pernickety, but was it a few months or a couple of months? She says it was more like a few months because he had this kind of, slide down. So he has to again ask her, not quicker than 2 months, but not longer than how many months? What are we talking about here? And she says, from memory, about 6 months, I think. And clearly she doesn't like being asked these specific questions. The next day she complains to his editors that his questions seemed, quote, seemed more akin to the gutter press, end quote. We're going to see this a lot. This is called the hostile media effect. Whenever someone asks us questions we don't really want to answer, they're threatening our feeling of closure, and we want to insult them. We want to characterize them as some sort of enemy group. But clearly all he's doing is trying to establish the details as well as he can. And that's what a journalist does. He's trying to get the facts, but she's trying to give him a narrative. And the reason this is significant is because in Wakefield's paper, the child is described as having his first behavioral symptoms 2 weeks, not 6 months, not even 2 months after, but 2 weeks. This is not within the time frame that this mother remembers. And so Brian Deere then asks John Walker Smith, one of the other co-authors on the paper, what to make of this. He says, there is no case in the paper that is consistent with the case history Mrs. Tu has given me. There just isn't one. So either what she is telling me is not accurate or the paper is not accurate. So Brian Deere goes down the list of patients of these children and notes the discrepancies between what their parents or what the medical records state and the description that Wakefield gives them in the paper. And in some of the other cases, not only are the symptoms happening too long after the MMR vaccination was received, but some of the symptoms are even occurring before the MMR vaccine is received. Obviously, that would be a problem if the symptoms show up before the purported cause. So what he's showing is that Wakefield actually changed the description to dismiss some of the symptoms of autism. By changing the description of behavioral symptoms to other physical symptoms, he's trying to erase the evidence that these children had signs of autism before they got the MMR vaccine. And Deere compiles all of this comparison into a single chart where he shows whether or not the Wakefield paper describes children as having regressive autism, whether they had the colitis that is supposedly indicative of the brain bowel syndrome that Wakefield claims to have discovered, whether or not the symptoms actually occurred just a few days after the MMR vaccination, and most importantly, whether all three of these things together occur. And none of the 12 children has a perfect match between what's listed in the records and what's described in Wakefield's paper. And again, these records come from the General Medical Council investigation that Brian Deere became a part of after the initial publication of his Sunday Times investigation. Now, those instances were instances of fabricating data, directly changing what was described in the records or in the parents' testimony to fit what Wakefield wanted the data to be. But there's also the problem of selecting evidence. Now, in any kind of scientific investigation, you have to have an experimental group, a group which gets this new treatment, for example, but you also have to have a control group. A control group or an experimental control is a group that is very similar to the experimental group, but they do not receive the experimental treatment, because you have to be able to see whether or not this outcome is actually caused by this new experimental thing, or is it just something that would have happened on its own. And to understand why this works, I'll take you back to the weights and selection task, where I ask you how many cards you need to turn over in order to test the rule that every card that has a D on one side must have a 3 on the other side, which is logically the same as if you're a bouncer and you don't want to lose your liquor license in your restaurant, you have to card or check the drinks of people who may be underage. So if you were a bouncer who only carded the guy with the beer, but you didn't check to see what was in the 19-year-old's daiquiri, your restaurant could lose your liquor license. You ended your investigation too soon. Similarly, if you turned over the card with the D on it to make sure that there was a 3 on the other side, but you didn't turn over the card with a 7 on it to see if there was a D on the other side, then you stopped your investigation too soon. For the same reason, you want to test the rule or the hypothesis that if a patient receives this treatment, P, then it will have this effect, Q. So the experimental group receives the treatment, the control group does not receive the treatment, and you want to make sure that the patient who receives the treatment also shows the effect. You also want to make sure that the patients who do not receive the treatment do not show the effect. And Wakefield didn't do this. This is what Brian Deere refers to as case selection. The families who brought their children to Wakefield for this study were almost all families who already believed that their children were infected with autism by the MMR vaccine. Most of them were sent by this group called JABs. Remember that jab is the British term for a shot or vaccination. And so they all had the right symptoms in the right order to fit this. In other words, this is a confirmation bias at the group level. They're not looking to test whether or not the MMR vaccine causes autism. They're looking to prove, and they're just looking for examples that will hold up that causal explanation rather than trying to falsify. As Brian Deers says, the evidence that launched the vaccine scare was bound to be found by the Royal Free Hospital's clinicians because this is how the children were selected. Instead of doing the scientific thing, which is falsification, which is having a control group to make sure that these symptoms aren't independent of the experimental condition, instead of doing falsification, they just use confirmation bias. And this is, of course, an example of motivated reasoning, starting with a conclusion and then looking to dress up that case with the best evidence, the most persuasive evidence, rather than all the evidence, or even a representative sample of evidence. And the motivation then becomes a very important issue. What was Wakefield's motivation to fabricate this information? Well, it was a very clear, very financial motivation. He was part of a lawsuit begun by a solicitor named Richard Barr, the goal of which was to sue the manufacturer of the MMR vaccine. So if you want to get a lot of money on a lawsuit and you want to sue the vaccine's manufacturer, then you want to try to prove that that vaccine is dangerous. So by the end of it, Andrew Wakefield had been paid £435,643 plus expenses. And this paper would be used to supposedly discover a symptom, this brain bowel symptom that is the link between the MMR vaccine and autism. But he had already stated that he believed this syndrome was the case. So the way motivated reasoning works is if you set out to discover something, you will probably discover it, whether it actually exists or not. And that brings us to the blog post by Jenny McCarthy. Just a few days after Brian Deers' first article appeared in the British Medical Journal, the actress and model and anti-vaccination activist Jenny McCarthy wrote a blog post in the Huffington Post that seemed to be a counter-argument or an attempt at a counter-argument to Brian Deers' article. After her son was diagnosed with autism, McCarthy became active in promoting autism research, funding autism treatment, and helping the families of children with autism. So this was already part of her identity at the time. In particular, she's become prominent for assuming that connection and promoting the idea that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And she's one of the people who used Andrew Wakefield's paper to argue that it was scientifically proven that there was a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. When Brian Deers' investigation was published in the British Medical Journal and people started talking about it, she seems to have felt compelled to respond on behalf of the people who support Wakefield. And she says, last week, parents were told a British researcher's 1998 report linking the MMR shot to autism was fraudulent. That this debate about vaccines and autism is now over, and parents should no longer worry about giving their children 6 vaccines at a single pediatric appointment or 36 by the time they're 5 years old. The link that she posts, and in on online format, the links typically serve as citations. But in this case, if you click on the link, it doesn't go back to Brian Deers' article. It goes back to a Huffington Post article about Brian Deers' article in the British Medical Journal. This seems to be her main source for Deers' argument. And this becomes obvious by the end of the sentence, because she seems to assume that Deers' article says that parents should no longer worry about giving their children 6 vaccines at a single pediatric appointment or 36 by the time they're 5 years old. But that, of course, is nowhere in Brian Deers' article. She doesn't cite a source for this, and clearly this is not something that Brian Deers writes about. Brian Deers' article is focused on Andrew Wakefield's paper and its accuracy or inaccuracy. This is an example of a straw man argument. So instead of arguing with what Brian Deers actually says, she makes up a different argument and shoots down that argument because it's easier to shoot down. Straw man arguments are usually just oversimplifying the premise or the conclusion of a different argument. But in this case, this is actually adding a premise that's not there, accusing him of saying something that he didn't say. This is not fundamentally different than what Wakefield did when he fabricated evidence to prove his case. McCarthy is now fabricating evidence to disprove the case of someone else. She continues, is that the whole story? Dr. Andrew Wakefield's study of 12 children with autism actually looked at bowel disease, not vaccines. The study's conclusion stated, we did not prove an association between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described, autism. So her argument here is that the only study ever to claim a link between the MMR and autism never actually claims to find a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. McCarthy herself, in her first sentence, said that the study was one that proved the link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Both she and Wakefield and other parents have used this study to prove their assumption that there is a link. But now she's saying that you can't disprove that article because it doesn't actually say that. So this would be a problem for both Wakefield and all the parents who use the study as evidence, but that's presuming that the quoted claim is true. Deere points out that the paper implies this connection with the phrase precipitating events, and Wakefield announced the study at a press conference in which he directly asserts that the study proved the MMR vaccine caused autism. McCarthy continues by saying, Dr. Wakefield did something I wish all doctors would do. He listened to parents and reported what they said. She's implying here that Brian Deere and the General Medical Council or whoever did not listen to parents, that these other doctors, anyone who disagrees with Wakefield, clearly hasn't talked to the parents. But if you actually read Deere's article, you know that he did talk to parents. He describes his interviews with the father of child number 11 and the mother of child number 2. He mentions that he contacted all the rest of the parents. Not all of the parents responded to his request for interviews. But yes, in fact, Brian Deere has asked the parents for their position. But McCarthy either doesn't know this because she hasn't read Brian Deere's paper, or she's deliberately ignoring it, but she's reframing the investigation of Wakefield as a sort of witch hunt. She presumes that Wakefield's job is just to ask the parents what they think their children's condition is and then report that and call it science. But of course, that's not how science works. She asks, since when is reporting the words of parents and recommending further investigation a crime? As I've learned, the answer is whenever someone questions the safety of any vaccines. This, again, is a straw man argument. Rather than actually looking at what Brian Deere's investigation actually concluded, she's characterizing Wakefield as this sort of martyr, and the parents and Wakefield as being attacked by this conspiracy for unspecified reasons, which is, again, a straw man argument. But even beyond that, she seems to miss the fact that the whole point of Deere's investigation was the conclusion that Wakefield did not repeat what parents told him. He changed what parents told him in order to enrich himself. When a mother told him that her son's symptoms began sometime after 2 months and between 2 months and 6 months after the MMR shot, he changes that to 2 weeks. That is not repeating what the parents say. That is fraud. And it's fraud in every single case. Wakefield changed what every single parent said to something that he wanted them to have said. This indicates once again that McCarthy has probably not read Brian Deere's article and clearly doesn't know what the article was about. She continues by saying, for some reason parents aren't being told that this quote-unquote new information about Dr. Wakefield isn't a medical report, but merely the allegation of a single British journalist named Brian Deere. Why does one journalist's accusations against Dr. Wakefield now mean that the vaccine autism debate is over? We can reconstruct this argument this way. She's claiming that the vaccine autism debate is not over because the counter-argument against the only study to report a connection between the MMR and autism is, quote, merely the allegations of a single British journalist. Now, you reconstruct that to find the warrant, and you see that the warrant is a journalist can't contribute anything to a debate about vaccines and autism. Because she's attacking Brian Deere not based on his argument, but based on who he is, what he does for a living, this is an ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is Latin for against the man or against the person. So this is when instead of pointing out problems with a premise in a counter-argument, you just insult or ridicule the person for something outside the argument. Even if the person making an argument is a bad person, has made bad arguments before, that doesn't say anything about the validity of the particular argument that person is making at the present. It's merely a diversionary tactic. It's very persuasive, but it's not very critical. It's also inaccurate when she says that parents aren't being told that this information comes from a journalist. In his article in the British Medical Journal, after his name is the word journalist. But it's also something that is published in a medical journal, and it's not just something that was submitted to a medical journal for publication by a journalist. It was something that journalist was invited to publish by the editor-in-chief and other editors of the British Medical Journal. Fiona Godley's editorial states that we thought the scam behind the scare should be told, and we asked Brian Deere to write 3 articles. Not only that, but the British Medical Journal independently verified Brian Deere's investigation by reading the transcript of the General Medical Council's investigation. And as Brian Deere points out, Wakefield is not a pediatrician. He's a former trainee gastrointestinal surgeon with a non-clinical medical school contract. And his interpretations of the data from these children differs with the pediatricians who knew those children, who diagnosed those children. So in other words, what McCarthy is claiming about Deere, that this is someone who's who's unqualified to make a medical diagnosis and who is directly contradicting the word of the people who've actually examined the children, it's actually Wakefield that is the one who is contradicting the word of the pediatricians who have examined these children. And of course, making an ad hominem argument opens up the door to a reciprocation of that ad hominem argument. If you're Jenny McCarthy, you might not want to open up that ad hominem argument. Her only claim to fame, the reason anyone knows who she is to start with, is because she began as a Playboy playmate. Now, this doesn't disqualify her from knowing anything about autism, but being a journalist certainly doesn't disqualify Brian Deere. In fact, as I mentioned, a journalist isn't just a commentator. A journalist is someone who actually gathers information, who gathers evidence to verify claims made by people like doctors, as well as politicians and business leaders and other people. She then quotes some of the parents whose children were examined by Wakefield, one of whom says, "How could the BMJ scrutinize what Brian Deere has said without looking at our children's medical notes, which they are not allowed to have? This needs to be challenged." Well, again, if they had actually read Brian Deere's article, they would know that the General Medical Council reviewed the notes. They did have access to those notes. They made those notes available to the British Medical Journal, which did its own investigation, both of which were independent of Brian Deere's investigations. Another parent says, "To hear my son's gastrointestinal condition has been extensively refuted by unqualified and ill-informed individuals who have never laid eyes on him, looking at and misinterpreting scanty medical notes without the courtesy to ask for our version of our son's early childhood, flies in the face of everything that the medical community and its professional bodies seek to represent." Well, there's quite a few problems with this quotation. The first is another straw man argument. No one is claiming that the child does not have some gastrointestinal condition. Deere's claim is that Wakefield re-described the symptoms to fit a syndrome that he made up. The question is not whether or not the child has a condition, it's a question of which condition he has and what caused that condition. The second clause has a different problem. We can reconstruct the claim and the reason within the clause like this. The claim is Deere and the General Medical Council were unqualified and ill-informed. The reason is that they did not ask for the parents' version of the children's medical history. First of all, that's a problem because it's not accurate. Deere and the GMC do have the parents' versions because they have the notes from the doctors that were taken at the time. So the premise that anyone who hasn't talked directly to the parents is ill-informed is unjustified, but it's taken for granted in the quotation. That makes it an example of begging the claim. Begging the claim is presuming that a premise has already been supported when it hasn't. This is also sometimes described as begging the question. Begging the question doesn't mean that you're raising a new question. It means that you're avoiding a question. You're giving an answer as if it's already proven when it's not already proven. In particular, the phrase unqualified and ill-informed. This is a complete mischaracterization of Deere and the General Medical Council. Now, if Britain's General Medical Council, the people who decide who gets to practice medicine and who don't, if they're not qualified to evaluate the data represented in a single medical paper, then who is? But this parent doesn't get into that. This parent just presumes that he or she is the one who decides what medical knowledge is and who's qualified to do medical research. And this parent also claims to speak on behalf of the entire medical community when he or she says that this flies in the face of everything that the medical community and its professional bodies seek to represent. This is both the begging the claim fallacy as well as an ad populum fallacy. An ad populum fallacy, which means to the population, to the people, is an emotional appeal based on group membership and the desire to fit in with other individuals in one's group, rather than an examination of the accuracy and validity of a premise. When someone says you should do something because everybody else is doing it, this isn't a very good argument, but it can elicit an emotional desire to fit in. When a politician says that the American people want this economic policy, he's giving up on arguing that the economic policy will actually work. He's not even bothering to find out what the people want through a vote or through a survey. He's just making a claim about a large group of people and using it as a reason to get what he wants. And the same thing is happening here. This parent is telling the General Medical Council that if you want to fit in with the rest of the doctors, you'd better think like we think. And finally, this is especially curious as gastrointestinal issues in autism are well recognized and documented and are included in the UK government's own best practice guidelines for early investigation and treatment. This last part seems to be a falsifiable claim supported by an identifiable source. The only problem is that even if it's true, it does not contradict Deere's argument. Deere's argument is that Wakefield selected and misrepresented evidence of a causal link between the MMR vaccination and autism. Even if there's a correlation between gastrointestinal issues and autism, it doesn't mean that the gastrointestinal issues caused the autism or that either of these issues was caused by the vaccination. So that premise isn't actually relevant. It's an example of yet another fallacy called a red herring. This is when you throw in a claim that does not actually function as a necessary premise in the argument. It just serves to distract or to change the subject to something the debater would rather talk about. So 4 fallacies in just 2 sentences. That's impressive, motivated reasoning. McCarthy then goes on to ask the American media directly, American media, why aren't we hearing from these parents? If Brian Deere's allegations are actually false, if the Lancet 12 parents stand with Dr. Wakefield, then what exactly are moms and dads supposed to think about last week's media circus? Well, this is again begging the question, Brian Deere's allegations are not actually false. The implied reason she gives is that the parents are the ones who decide who's right and who's wrong. But again, the parents' testimony, the medical records, the testimony of the pediatricians who first diagnosed the children, all of these sources of information have already been found to contradict Wakefield's reported results by 3 separate investigations. Rather than dealing with these investigations, Jenny McCarthy just continues to presume that she's right and that anyone who disagrees with her is wrong and continues to beg the question. And that's when we get to the real core, not only of McCarthy's rebuttal to Deere's investigation, but also to the core of the whole belief that the MMR or any other vaccine causes autism or any other disease. That is when she says, I know children regress after vaccination because it happened to my own son. The sentence is structured as an enthymeme, which means we can pretty easily find the warrant. In order for that argument to make any sense, we have to have the additional premise, the warrant, that what happens to my child happens to other children. This is a generalization, and remember that most of our knowledge is based on generalization. Generalization is not a bad thing. But when we make a generalization based on one example, or even just a few examples, we risk making a hasty generalization. This is also known as an overgeneralization. It's sometimes hard to tell whether a generalization is hasty or not. It has to be a falsifiable claim. We have to be able to test it. If the generalization is so vague that no counter evidence is possible, it's an overgeneralization or hasty generalization. In this case, we have to be able to test to see if what happened to McCarthy's son is exactly the same thing that happened to other children. So what precisely happened to McCarthy's son that makes him relevant to the Wakefield study? If her son's history of autism is relevant to the vaccine autism debate, she must be using him as an example of a causal link. So when she says that her son regressed after vaccination, clearly she presumes that he regressed because of vaccination. This is another fallacy called post hoc fallacy. This comes from the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. So when an unusual event happens and we don't know the cause, we look for a cause. And I mean, we look for one cause. We tend to presume that every identifiable event has a single cause rather than multiple causes. I'll talk more about this when I discuss the stasis of causation in a later lecture. But for now, it should be obvious that many things happen in the lives of children that could be causes of disorders. No scientific researcher other than Wakefield has been able to find evidence that the MMR vaccine is the cause of autism. Wakefield's evidence was forged. So all that's left is the assumption that parents make about the MMR causing autism simply because it's one of the events in the child's life that occurred before the symptoms of autism began to appear. If it did appear before those symptoms began to appear. As we saw in some of the cases, the children were showing signs of autism beforehand. The parents just didn't pay much attention to it or didn't link that to the later symptoms which confirmed the condition of autism. If millions of children are given the MMR shot, some of that population is later going to develop autism. Also, some children in that population are going to become spelling bee champions. Is that because of the MMR vaccine? Well, there's just as much evidence that the MMR vaccine will make you a spelling bee champion as that it will make you autistic. But the reason McCarthy and others focus on the MMR vaccine as the likely culprit seems to have more to do with their belief about the pharmaceutical industry and Western medicine in general. They're primed by a belief in the naturalistic fallacy, which is the belief that natural things are better and healthier than man-made things. This becomes apparent when we read the rest of that paragraph. Why aren't there tests out there on the safety of how vaccines are administered in the real world, 6 at a time? Why have only 2 of the 36 shots our kids receive been looked at for their relationship to autism? Why hasn't anyone ever studied completely non-vaccinated children to understand their autism rate? Again, this is begging the question. It's presuming that this information is not out there, when in fact there's a great deal of study out there on the safety of vaccines. Most of it doesn't actually get posted on the Huffington Post. These missing, again, presuming that it's missing, these missing safety studies are causing many parents to approach vaccines with moderation. Why do other first world countries give children so many fewer vaccines than we do? What if a parent used the vaccine schedule of Denmark, Norway, Japan, or Finland, countries that give 1/3 of the shots we do? 12 shots versus 36 shots in the US. Vaccines save lives, but might be harming some children. Again, begging the question. There's still no evidence that any vaccine is harming children. She's begging the question. Is moderation such a terrible idea? All of these questions might be relevant. It would be nice to have more accessible information about the trials that vaccinations have gone through. It might be good to have a debate about why Americans use a different vaccination schedule than these other countries. But these issues have nothing to do with the fact that Andrew Wakefield fabricated data in order to reach a foregone conclusion about a cause between the MMR vaccine and autism. She concludes by saying, "This debate won't end because of one dubious reporter's allegations. I have never met stronger women than the moms of children with autism. Last week, this hoopla made us a little stronger and even more determined to fight for the truth about what's happening to our children." Quite a bit wrong with this. McCarthy clearly has no idea what evidence Brian Deere has collected. She clearly hasn't even read the BMJ article. And all she seems to understand is that someone has disputed her belief that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And because she's so certain that her post hoc belief is the truth, she sees anyone who questions it as the literal enemy, waging a war against her and the mothers of autistic children. She calls Deere's investigation hoopla, and she declares that the response to it shouldn't be to read it, much less to consider that evidence. Instead, she says that she will fight it. If you say that you're fighting for the truth, it can only mean that you already have the truth, and that anyone who disagrees with you is the enemy of the truth and must be defeated. Since McCarthy never specifies how her premises lead to the conclusion, she leaves that up to the reader. The phrase "because of" doesn't actually make the first sentence an enthymeme because it doesn't specify how the reason actually supports the claim. You're just supposed to fill that in. It presumes that you already agree with her. It's begging the claim. But it incorporates premises like Brian Deere is dubious and his evidence, which is verified by Britain's General Medical Council, can be dismissed as just allegations. It also presumes that anyone who points out counter evidence to the belief that vaccines cause autism is at war with the mothers of autistic children. It presumes that ignoring evidence is a sign of strength. It presumes that the more counter evidence confronts us, the harder we will fight against it. It presumes that we will fight for the truth we already have against the evidence that doesn't fit that foregone conclusion. For such a short piece of writing, McCarthy's article includes an impressive number of logical fallacies. Obviously, it doesn't come anywhere close to refuting a single premise in Brian Deere's article, but that's clearly not McCarthy's goal. She doesn't want to understand enough to refute. She just wants to fight. And that's what motivated reasoning is. That's how it works. It's fighting for a foregone conclusion rather than trying to understand it. And we've seen this happen a lot throughout the semester, starting with doctors, starting with a woman who was misdiagnosed because her doctors saw a pattern they recognized, but it was the wrong pattern. It was a heuristic that worked 9 times out of 10, but this was that 10th time for which the pattern didn't fit. They made an attribution error about what they thought caused something. But once they were anchored to that error, they had that feeling of closure, and in order to maintain that feeling, in order to sort of feel satisfied, they just looked for evidence that supported that foregone conclusion. They didn't look to falsify it. And that need for closure is very powerful, that desire to seize on the first available answer and then freeze on it, not have to question it, not have to look at counter evidence. It leads us to look for abstract generalizations like vaccines cause illness that are so vaguely worded that we can't disprove them, or that they're hard to disprove. And importantly, as we see in McCarthy's article and with the parents that she quotes, it leads to this demand for consensual knowledge. In other words, we want other people to accept our conclusions. If someone gathers counter evidence to our foregone conclusions, we tend to treat that person as an enemy when we have that need for closure. And unfortunately, this is what evolutionary psychology shows us that human beings have kind of always done with reasoning. Reasoning isn't primarily used as a means to find the truth. It's primarily used as a way to influence other people, to persuade other people to elevate our own status, to believe us, to do what we want. McCarthy's blog post was an argument of persuasion. Part of her persuasiveness comes from the fact that she persuaded herself first that she was right. She has the conviction of a martyr, and that makes anyone who contradicts her look like an enemy, who's attacking a mother who's just trying to defend her own child. But at no point does she deal with the reality, the evidence that Brian Deere gathered, that the General Medical Council validated. Deere, on the other hand, takes years to collect differing accounts and then weighing those accounts against each other. And this is what critical reasoning is, the opposite of motivated reasoning. Trying to falsify all the accounts, seeing if they pass that test, and only accepting them once they pass the falsification test. So we don't always have to choose between being persuasive and finding the truth, but this case study examines an issue where that seems to be the case, where the scientific evidence and the popular opinion are irreconcilable, and the emotional commitment to the wrong answer is continually beating back the facts, who's resisting evidence, ignoring evidence in this case. Because we see with so many people, it's not about evidence, it's about what group you're a part of. Now we're going to use this case study and the last one throughout the rest of the semester in order to look at how to balance those goals, how to inform people of something that they don't already know, something they may be wrong about. But then later we're going to look at ways that we can become more persuasive after we use critical reasoning to get the best possible argument, then trying to do things other than use logical fallacies in order to make that argument more persuasive.